that describe me. Probably not all of them, but I tried to pick out some relevant ones. You can kind of see, Chris will jab me about this, but auditor is up there. And yes, I was an auditor for 14 years. Of course, Chris would say that. I stopped being an auditor back in August and went into information security. I do have that a little smaller than auditor, but the reason why I don't have that as a bigger word is because I think that geek, Ghostnomad, husband, father, haiku are more important than being an auditor, although an auditor has played a big role in what I am today. So in thinking about this talk today and what I did as an auditor, when you have an auditor come in to look at your education system as part of the audit, they want to see certificates that people went to talks or seminars that they know what they're doing. And so to me, that kind of seems like not the greatest test that an auditor can do, because just looking at a certificate or just looking at a list of CPEs that you got for the year doesn't tell if you really understand the information. The other word I have here is father, and the reason why I use that to describe me, especially for this talk, is because I have 4 kids, ages 2 to 9, and I see how they learn. Every day they bring home their homework, which is always a joy to get done, and I see how they learn and how they pick things up, and I try to mimic that in the way I learn because they have a very fresh perspective. They still have a lot to learn in life, and they haven't been jaded by a lot of things we may have been. So I try to take that into the perspective that I use. Haiku, I do write haiku. It kind of started out on a whim. But what I've learned from haiku that teaches me about education is that sometimes you need to simplify to get the message across at first, but then you have to go more in depth to get the complexity around that. And so I write haiku. I try to do it every day. I've been really bad this last week because I've been trying to get my slides ready, so I do apologize if any of you do follow the blog that there haven't been as many haiku. But more importantly for this talk is the word husband. My wife is a school neuropsychologist, and 6 years ago, somebody came to her and said, "We want you to stop being a school psychologist. We want you to stop testing kids and placing them in special education, and we want you to take a different approach to the way we do this." And so that approach is actually what has driven a lot of what my talk is about here today. And so her work really plays into this. So being a husband is probably one of the more important things to this talk that I bring. Okay, so we all, as security people, we all like to draw pictures on whiteboards, and so this is my picture. As you can see, this is a traditional school perception. It's the black box. We send our kids in, they come out with a diploma. So we've got the little kid on the left-hand side. He's getting ready to go into the school, and of course he comes out with a diploma. But we don't really know, we don't really think about what happens when they're there. We know that they bring home homework and we got to get it done, and they got all these projects that they always like to put off. But to us, school is a black box. Now, we can go back and think back to when we were in school and the different things we did, but a lot of times we don't think about that anymore. And a lot of things have changed probably since most of us have gone through school. And that's a lot of what my wife has been driving in her district. So before we talk about education, we have to talk about intelligence. And I got this bell curve off of Wikipedia for proper attribution. But the reason why intelligence is so important is because we're all intelligent people here, right? I mean, we wouldn't be in information security if we weren't. So we like to put ourselves at the top of this list. But what's important to understand about intelligence is that the majority of people, you can see the two dark blue areas, make up 68% of the population. So 68% of the population falls within one standard deviation of average. So if 100 is average, that means that within that standard deviation each way, you have 68% of the people. So 68% of the people are of average intelligence. And then on each side of that, you have about 13, 14%. And those 13 to 14% are your above average and your below average. And if you really look closely, you've got about 90% of your population falls from that 2 standard deviations below average all the way up to the top. Now, again, in our organizations, we might like to think that we're dealing with the top-notch people. But in reality, if you look at this, thinking about 68% of the people are normal intelligence. We're dealing with a broad range of people. So we can't just say, well, why aren't our users getting it? They should know this. They're in business. They should be able to get this. But really, intelligence is a broad range. And the other thing of intelligence that we may not think about is when you go to school, to determine your intelligence, they give you an IQ test. We all like to talk about IQ. What an intelligence test tells somebody is what's your abilities, what's your potential to achieve. There's another aspect to intelligence in schools that they talk about, and that's achievement. And when you have a disparate intelligence to achievement, then you have what's called a learning disability. And so you may have a high potential. You could be up in that top tier. You may even be in the normal tier. But if your achievement is below where your intelligence is, that means that there's something impeding your ability to learn. Now, in schools, what they do is the traditional role was to have the school psychologist test the kid, find out if they were having a disability, if they have a problem learning, and then place them in some type of program to help them learn better. And sometimes that's a good thing and sometimes that's a bad thing. But you could have somebody at the high range who has a disability. And so they get help with that disability, and they're able to graduate. And when they come into the business environment, we say, well, they're above average intelligence because they graduated, and so they should just get this. And we don't deal with the problems that they've had to deal with their whole life. So we assume that everybody learns the same, and we assume that we're all of above average intelligence, when in actuality, we have a broad range of intelligence. And the other important thing to think about is that we're not just talking about in our organizations the employees that we deal with anymore, especially with security. We're also talking about customers. And customers go even beyond the range that's probably within our organization. So we may have standards as to who we hire, and those standards may have some bearing on intelligence, although as we see, most likely the majority of our population is down in the average range, which isn't a bad thing. We also have to deal with customers who can be a broad range. And so the important thing to get out of that is we're all unique learners. We all have our own strengths and weaknesses. One of the things that they found with intelligence is that there's not just one number. You hear people say, well, I have an IQ of 119, and that's above average. But what's important is that within that IQ number, there's different components that make that final number. And so you may have a strength in mathematics, but have a weakness in English. You may have a hard time remembering things, but you have an ability to do other things. So we don't always talk about those unique things within our intelligence that make up that final score. And so we just want to say, well, I'm intelligent, so I get it. But in reality, there's different components to that, and there's different ways that we can have difficulty learning. And so I'm back to the binaries. Again, when I talked about the traditional role of a school, we send our kids in. To get to that diploma, our kids have to pass. So it's a binary thing. You either pass or you fail. There's no middle ground. Now, of course, you say, well, you could get an A, B, C, D, or an F. And if you get a D all the way up to an A, you pass. And if you get an F, you fail. And that's true. And that's important when you go through school to know where you're in. But again, it's a binary system. It's a pass or a fail. And so what the schools and what my wife has been trying to do is to try to step away from that binary way of pass or fail and take a different approach to how they educate students. And so we have our kid here, and he's getting ready to go off to school. And we've kind of peeled back the black box. And now we're looking inside to see what happens. Besides just going to classes and learning, we need to see what happens within the black box that makes it tick. Because ultimately, some of these strategies that are used in the schools can be used in a business environment. And so the first thing I want to talk about within that black box is called response to intervention, or RTI. Now, this is a program that my wife was handed 6 years ago, and there wasn't a lot of work in it, and so she had to go and create a manual from scratch. And it's a challenge because when you talk about the way education has been for many years, you get a kid in, you educate them, you put them out. If they have a problem, you let the school psych test them, you put them in a special program, that gets them through. And that way of thinking, you can only have so many people doing so many special things. And so what response to intervention said was, let's take another look, let's take another approach and see how we can intervene in the kids' daily lives and something that may benefit more than just that one student. So instead of identifying one kid, putting them out there, let's try to help everybody. And so the goals of response to intervention are these three right here: to identify, to monitor, and to intervene. Identify means identify kids that are at risk. Now, we may not know it, but you may be mildly at risk. And there may be a lot of people in the class that are mildly at risk. But because it's not severe enough, normally you wouldn't be identified to be sent to the school psychologist because, again, we go back to this, what I described before, and I'll call it now the discrepancy model of your intelligence is here and your achievement is down here. If it's not big enough gap, then we can't necessarily do anything about it because there's federal guidelines as to who gets identified as special ed. But in RTI, the idea is that we don't go straight to the psychologist first. First, we identify the students at risk, and that may be the entire population, or that may be a few kids in the entire population. But we can come up with an intervention that helps everybody, not just one kid. And so maybe it's better to use our resources to intervene across the entire classroom as opposed to just pulling that one kid out. So to intervene is that intervention. Now, in between identify and intervention is monitor. What does that mean? And this is a big part of what I want to talk about today. Monitoring progress, monitoring what that kid is doing to see if those interventions are actually helping. Because if an intervention isn't helping, we need to change the way we're going. Otherwise, we're just spinning our wheels. We're not doing anything more than we could have before. So response to intervention's goal is to identify, to monitor, and to intervene. And on that intervention side, they've come up with this thing that's called a 3-tiered model. And what the 3-tier model does is it segregates out where those interventions should be placed. And so, again, I talked about maybe the whole classroom's having a problem, and so we want to intervene. So that's your tier 1. That's your general interventions. These are things like if you have students that have difficulty reading, having extended reading time for the entire classroom, because maybe not everybody's getting it. And so you extend it for everybody. And that might be enough to help those kids that are mildly at risk. It might not be. And so what you do is you go to the second tier, which is called the specialized tier, or specialized interventions. This is where you may have a group, a smaller group out of the general population that you pull aside to do some extra work with. Again, you haven't singled out one kid yet, and you haven't sent them to the psychologist yet. What you've done is you're trying to intervene before you get to that point. And so we've gone from having the whole group to having a subset of the group. And again, it could be extended time doing reading. It could be extended time doing many different things. And then if you've gone through tier 1 and tier 2, and you still have a kid who's having difficulty, and you know they're having difficulty because you're monitoring their progress, you get to the intensive tier. This is your tier 3. At this point in the education system, this is where you say, okay, we've done a lot for this child. Now we think he really needs to go through to see the school psychologist or to be tested to see if we can place him in a special environment. And that doesn't always mean they're going to be taken out of the classroom, but it may mean that they have intensive one-on-one training. Now, the interesting thing here when I talk about the school psychologist, in order to get special services in schools, you have to be labeled. As technology people, as information security people, we've always had labels like geek, nerd, all those things. And sometimes those labels can hurt us. And so think about the kids who have to go through their school-age life with a label on themselves. Now, not that it's shared with their classmates, but if you think back to when you were in school, you can think about the kids who had to go off to that room to have their special time, whether they were talented and gifted or whether they had a learning disability. And so it's not, it's not that these kids are being identified in class as saying, well, you're special, but you see them at recess time, they're not out there because they're in the room with a tutor getting some special help. Or they get to go out to the trailer at a special time to have some help. So that's a label that has to be with that child to get those services. And so that's why the Tier 1 and Tier 2 are so important, is that gives us the ability to reach out to those kids before they're labeled to try to help them and maybe not even put that label on them. But the Tier 1 and Tier 2 people may not qualify for a label to begin with. And so we've gone from the theory of let's just test and place those kids that really need it, and then everybody else is just kind of on their own, and if you get an A or a D, that's up to you, to let's really try to help everybody. And so we've gone through this 3 tiers, and the glue that holds it together is the idea of progress monitoring. And I really want to talk a lot about progress monitoring because this is a key to a lot of things. Now, part of progress monitoring is that you have to give an assessment to all the students across the board, and you find out where they're at. And that way you are identifying where there's weaknesses. Now, I talked about binary education. In a progress monitor setting, it's not a binary education. You don't give a kid a test and say, here's a quiz, you're going to pass or fail it. You give them an assessment, and you say, I want you to fill this out as best you can. You may not get to all the questions, but it's important that you try your hardest. And you give that assessment to them. Now, we're trained to think in a binary fashion. We're trained that when we're handed what we call a test, but an assessment, we think, okay, I got to do my best. I really got to do this. And I can think, if any of you have kids, I know mine just went through this, they oftentimes have things like the Iowa test in school. And as parents, we get these notes home that say, hey, there's going to be this assessment coming up, just want to let you know. And as parents, are like, well, I want my kid to do the best that they can. So you need to eat a really good breakfast that day. You need to go to bed early so that you're well rested. But it's an assessment. It's an assessment of what they know. It's not a test to pass or fail them. And so what's important in progress monitoring is that we do this assessment. We hand it to them. We have them do the best that they can. Now, of course, we're going to have the results of individuals because we need to know what your strengths are and what your weaknesses are. But as a class, you get an idea of not only how well the students are learning, but how well the teacher is doing and how well the curricula is designed. And so it's really critical that we progress monitor. Another aspect of this is that it's a feedback loop. Again, I talked about how well a teacher is doing and how well a classroom is doing. You may get a progress monitoring, an assessment back, and the kids do not even line up with where they're supposed to be. But, so the first thing to do is say, well, the teacher isn't doing their job. Well, what we need to do is we need to look at the teacher to see if they have the proper resources, see if they have the proper time to cover the topics. Because one of the biggest things that's coming out of a change in our education system is that we have this idea of testing a kid to make sure that they know what they need enough to pass. And so not only do you have to pass your classes today in school, you have to take this, I'm losing the name of it right now, but there's an assessment that's given to all students in Ohio, and you take it in the 4th grade, the 9th grade, and then the 12th grade. And if you don't pass that test, Ohio Proficiency Test, if you don't pass that test, you don't get the diploma that says that you should graduate. You get a different kind of diploma. And so it's an assessment, but to an extent there is a pass or fail. And so what happens is we're teaching to a test. And we don't want, in progress monitoring, to be teaching to the test. What we want the assessment to be, or the test, is a true measure of where we're at. And so we go through this big thing, and hopefully in the end, instead of having a certain population of kids graduate, now we've extended help, and now we have potentially more kids graduating, or at least the kids that are graduating that have problems that will be with them for the rest of their lives, have had more help to have a better understanding of what their education is. But these kids graduate, and where do they go? They go to college, and they come into, or they may not, and they may go right into the workforce. And so when you talk about education in the workforce, you're getting all these kids, and we're just assuming, back to that intelligence, that they have a certain level that they're coming into business with. What we're not looking at is the fact that everybody is coming in as a unique learner. Everyone has their own strengths and weaknesses, and we forget that. And so for businesses, it's really important, in stepping away from a binary educational system, to know that everybody is coming in their own unique fashion. And we can design our education programs in business in one way for one group. And we just say, well, you should get it because you work for us now. Or you should get it because you're a part of this organization. Or you should get it because you passed a test to get a certification. And that's another aspect of this that I want to briefly touch on with business, is that we have these certifications. I have a CISA, if you saw that on my tag cloud. The thought is that we study really hard, and we go in and we take a test. And that test says that we're proficient enough to get this designation. And then each year we're asked to get continuing education. I mean, we all go to conferences so that we can get those CEPEs or CEUs or whatever you want to call them. But going back to that audit step, what do those CPEs, what does that continuing ed tell about what you've learned? It may not tell you anything except that you went to something and you got the certificate afterwards. You may walk out with no more knowledge than what you walked in with. That could happen with this talk. You may walk out without anything more than what you walked in with. But the key is that we've just been given a certificate now saying we got it. And your certification then says, well, do you have enough of those CPEs? Check yes, and we move on. And so in one aspect, that's where education equals compliance. We've complied with the rules of what our certification asks. Another aspect of education as compliance in business is that we probably all have an annual security training that we have to do. If you're in a regulated organization, your regulators probably require that you show that you have done that security certificate or security training, along with many other trainings that may apply to your organization. Whether you're in healthcare, you may have to show that you've had HIPAA training. If you're in banking, you have Graham-Leach-Bliley and all sorts of other things. If you're in manufacturing, you may have to have people who are doing certain tasks be certified, to show that you're in compliance with regulations. So in business, we've become to look at education as a means to compliance. And that's the same with security. If you want to look at security, a lot of people complain about the different regulations like PCI and things like that. And they say that just because you're PCI compliant doesn't mean you're secure. And we have to stop looking at compliance as the end game. Compliance is just a step. Somebody's going to come in and check that box. What we really need to do is to make compliance a byproduct. We need to develop our systems, whether they're security or education, so that when you get at the end of the day, you're done, you've got an educated workforce or educated customer base, and you meet compliance requirements. And so we have to ask, what is the goal of our education program in business? Now, there's two terms that get thrown out, awareness and education. And for the purposes here, awareness to me is making someone, exactly that, making someone aware, whether it is handing out tchotchkes that say, be secure, remember to change your password, whether it's a poster on a wall. That's making you aware. The idea behind awareness to me is that you bring it to someone's attention, and either you're reminding them of what it is, or you're making them want to go learn more. But awareness in and of itself doesn't educate you. And so if we want to educate people, and I hope that we do, because through education I think we can become more secure, we have to ask ourselves, is the program that we're designing for compliance? Is it for awareness? Or is it to educate And through that education, we become compliant and become more secure. And so I'm going to harp on this again, pass or fail, binary thinking. We go to that, we do that annual assessment, and we have to show the regulators some way that people did that. Whether they have to sign a form, whether they have to take a quiz, we have to do something that shows that they passed it or that they failed it. But is that our goal as security people? I mean, I would hope that our goal is to have security. Right? So we're not concerned about pass or failing. I mean, we are because we want that checkbox, but we're concerned about security. And so when we design our educational systems, when we think about how we want to educate people, we have to think about security first. And so we have to ask ourselves, is that once a year training enough? And I would say it's not, because I think if you follow Twitter, if you read any blogs, if you follow anything, people are always complaining about how users don't get it. My users don't get it. They never do this right. They're always losing their passwords. There's Post-it notes everywhere. You know, there's always something that's not being gotten. Well, is it their fault? I mean, yes, they should be able to be responsible people and not do these things. But do we remind them enough? Do we educate them enough to understand the risk of what's actually happening? And so, what do we need to do in our educational system once we have a goal? If our goal is security, we need to design a program about security. And it's not just those big topics that the regulators want us to teach about. It should be everything. I mean, we should go through our policies and design a program that educates our users about our policies, but not just our policies, because we're not just talking, when we say users, we're not just talking about employees, we're also talking about customers. And it's beneficial to not only train people about what our organizations want, what we require from security, but also how they can be more secure outside of their work or outside of doing business with us. And so if a user goes home and writes down all their passwords for all their internet sites that they get on, how can we expect them to come to work and not do the same thing? It's a trained behavior. If you want to go back and say, well, it's Pavlov's dog, the idea that we get in such a routine, we can't break out of it because it's been ingrained. And so we need to not only educate for security in the workforce, but we need to educate for security outside of the workforce. And so we need to design our programs so that it covers not only the security that we want them to get, but how to be secure in general. The next step in any education program is to deliver the training, deliver the education. So if you want to think about this in the 3-tier model to bring in RTI, we have our general security awareness program, right? And so that's our tier 1. We're giving everybody an intervention as to what security is. As we go through this, we're going to see that not everybody's going to get it. And so once we deliver that program, we need to progress monitor. Now, this is not pass and fail. Again, we're stepping away from that binary way of thinking. What we need to do is we need to assess, instead of test, what our users know. What did they get out of that training? And it's not just a once-a-year thing. What we really need to do is to design a system that on a frequent basis, whether it's every quarter, every other month, monthly, whatever you decide is best for your organization, to go out and to ask our users questions to see if they understand what we've taught them. And this is our feedback loop. This is the most important part of an education system. If it comes back after our first training that 90% of the people don't get what we said, we've failed. We failed because we didn't educate the users. And so where we're complaining that our users don't get it, they don't get it because we didn't help them get it. And so if we're progress monitoring, we know they don't get it. And we can quickly go back and refine what we're doing. And so if you really want to talk about it, we go all the way back to the design phase. And we design a new program based on that feedback we've gotten. Not all elements have to be thrown out. Maybe more elements have to be emphasized. And then once we do that design, we have to deliver it again. It's important that this becomes a loop. It's not a once-a-year thing. Education is a loop. And after we give it, we test them again. I shouldn't say test. We assess them again. And hopefully, after the next time, they're getting it. Now, if we're giving them the same thing over and over again, we should expect the same results. Now, you would say, that doesn't make sense. They should get better at it. But the point is that we're not making them more secure. We're just giving them the same information over and over. And there's a reason why they're not getting it. And so when I talk about refining, it's important that you go back and you change the way you're presenting what you want them to get. Because if you're not changing it, they're not going to get it. And it's not their fault, even though we would like to think it. And that may be a very unpopular thing. I may be getting daggers thrown at me right now, which is fine. It's not a popular way to think. But the point is that if we want people to be secure, we have to teach them how to be secure, and we have to understand how they think. Remember, each person's a unique learner. Now, if we go through this and we see that after the second time we give the awareness program or the education, now only 30% don't get it. Okay, well, there's no reason to pull everybody back in and give them all that same information. Let's take that 30%. Let's take those people that are still having difficulty and not look at it as them failing, but look at it as them needing that second tier. We need to move them up. We need to pull them aside as an individual group. And don't send out an email saying, well, due to your inability to pass the first 2 times, you need to now come in. What we need to say is that we've identified you as a person who we feel would benefit from extended security education. And so we would like for you to come in and join us so that we can help you better understand certain things. It's all about the way you frame it. When I was in audit, I had to deliver bad news quite frequently because I audited governments for a long time. And unfortunately, governments don't have a lot of resources, so they have a hard time doing the right thing, even though they want to. And so I had to go into a post-audit, or I had to go in and tell a client, you're doing this wrong. Now, if I walked into a client and said, you're doing this wrong, how do you think they're going to react to me? They're going to look at me like I'm from planet Mars, and that all I did was come in with a checkbox, and what do I really know about the way they're doing things? So it's about how you deliver the message. So going into a client, if I was in audit, I would have gone back into a client and I said, I understand that you have limited resources. I understand that doing these things are very difficult. But these are the things that I identified where there may be some more risk. And I think and I know that you want to be more secure, and I know you want to reduce your risk. So in order to do that, these are the things you need to really think about and need to focus on. Now, not all auditors do that. I know a lot of auditors may come in and just slam down the report and say, fix it, and that's it. And that's not the right way to do it, but that's not for this talk. So as we go through this progress monitor, we get more and more people that should flesh out that understand it. That doesn't mean that we should stop educating them. We should continue to educate them. But what we should do is then increase our intensity of focus for the people that still aren't getting it. And ultimately, as we go through and we progress monitor and we refine, we're going to weed out those few people that are really having trouble getting it. And those people are the people we really need to bring in and do some one-on-one time with and try to understand where they're having difficulty. Don't make it a, you don't get security. Make it a, I want to understand why you're not getting security or why you're having difficulty with this. And it may be something as simple as, well, you tell us not to write our passwords down, but I do it at home, and I don't know what to do at home. Okay, well, that's something simple we can fix. Here's some resources that you can use at home to keep your passwords instead of writing them down on a piece of paper. And so, really, that response to intervention model, that 3-tier model, and that progress monitoring can be incorporated into the way we do education in a business environment. And it's important that I think that we take a look at the way we do that. And so we've got our security person here. And we know he's security because he's thinking about O-Day, right? This is the way I drop O-Day in a talk. Yeah, I have to trump Kennedy before he gets here. So here's me dropping O-Day, right? Okay. So we got our security guy, and he's going into the business. The business's job, if we go to that black box and we're talking about education, the business's job isn't to take an employee in and produce a graduate. That's not what we're in the business for. We're in the business to produce a product or a service. And so the reason why we bring that security person in is hopefully, as the lock shows us, to be more secure. Now, we can think that our job as security is just about doing those things that we like to do in security, those geeky things. But in reality, we also have to focus on the people that we want to be secure. Because ultimately, we have people, process, and technology, right? So security people, we like to focus on process. Let's call that documentation and standards and policies. That's our process. Those are the things we put in place so that we're more secure. And we've got the technology. We've got our fancy firewalls and our fancy things to detect intrusions and things to prevent intrusions, and we've got all the blinking lights in our data centers. But the question is, people. What do we do about our people? Because in security, we all know that the strength of our security program relies on our weakest point. And since we complain about our users so much, obviously the weakest point is people. But if we don't educate the people, how can we become more secure? How can we call ourselves security people if we don't cover all three processes? Now, I'm not saying that each of us should go and talk to people, because we're not all people. Kind of redundant. But we don't all know how to educate people. But what we can do is know that process needs to be in place. And as security people, as we see events happening, if we're that operational person, if we're down in the weeds and we see these things happening, we need to go back to our education people and say, hey, I'm seeing a lot of this stuff happening. Obviously, our users aren't getting it. We need to do a better job educating. If you're responsible for educating end users, then people is your thing. Once we educate people, once we strengthen that part of it, then our process and technology are a lot stronger, because we've hit the weak point. Now again, this isn't in a business environment. This just isn't the users within our organizations. It's our customers, because most businesses nowadays have some kind of web front. Whether we're providing services through that web front, whether we're selling products through that web front, we're taking in information from customers. And that opens us up. That opens us up to the O-Day. That opens us up to all those things that we already know is bad and people aren't getting. And again, education doesn't just stop with end users. We also need to educate developers. If we have developers in our organization, or if we're dealing with organizations who develop our products, we need to make sure that they're educated on security. And so the population of who we're educating is broad. We can't just think about, I'm in security or I'm in technology and these are the people I deal with. We have to understand that our organization goes across all employees and also deals with customers. And so the education program needs to be designed around the people. Now, I've thrown a lot of stuff out there, and I've focused a lot about psychology, mostly because my wife's a school neuropsychologist. She's much smarter than me. The change isn't easy. She's been doing this for 6 years in her district, and she still gets fought every day on trying to implement this, because education for so long has had a way it's done things. It's that black box. Put the kid in, the kid comes out. And so when we go try to take this to the business environment, it's not going to be easy. There's a lot of people who are going to say, well, why do we need to progress monitor? Let's just get the compliance done, and we'll deal with those security issues as they come up. The point is that education, like security, doesn't have a direct ROI. We all love that word. We all love that phrase, return on investment. What's the return on investment of putting in a firewall? Well, if you don't get owned, then you don't get sued, right? So what's the value of education? Again, people, process, technology. We have to invest in each and every one of those, maybe not equally, but we need to make sure that each one is strengthened, because without that strength in each area, we're as weak as that weakest point. And so what I may say here may not be popular. You guys may get it, but your organizations may not. There's a lot of people who may not understand this. But if you want to do it right, I think that this is a good start. I'm not saying it's the end-all be-all, but it's a good start, and it gives us that feedback to understand why our users aren't getting it and where they need the help. All right, so as I said before, I do haiku, and in the last couple talks I've given about audit, I haven't done an haiku, and I've caught flack from Chris and Tom and some other people. So I wanted to do the haiku, just a box. Designed to protect, must configure properly, otherwise useless. Now, this is technology, and if you have a firewall and you don't configure it properly, you got nothing. You got a big truck can drive right through your security. Well, it's the same with people. If we don't configure them properly, if we don't give them the right information, it's useless. Security is useless because we're asking them to do something they don't understand. So whether you're talking about a box in your data center or a person sitting out in your organization or in your customer base, we have to configure it properly. And that configuration comes in people through education. And I don't believe that a once-a-year thing is good enough to educate. I think we need to make sure that we're doing something throughout the year to continue to enforce those things. And I think that using that three-tier model to intensify the message that we're trying to get across instead of passing or failing people, we'll get a better feedback than just saying, take a test, pass or fail, or here's a certificate, that's your pass. You came to the class, you pass. You didn't come to the class, you fail. You don't get that certificate, you don't get your CPEs. We need to have that feedback loop. And so when I first wrote this was about a piece of technology, but as I was looking through it last night, I realized this actually deals with people too. So, where can you talk to me at? My email is ghostnomad@ghostnomad.com. Twitter, I'm at ghostnomad. And my blog is ghostnomad.com. That's where I write about semi-related information security things. And then IT haiku, I have, I think, about 587 haiku now, when I last counted. So you can interact with me there. And I really would encourage you, since I've been talking about progress monitoring, to give me feedback. Send me an email. Hit me up on Twitter and tell me what you got out of it, what you didn't get out of it. Send me an email, same thing. I'm hoping to post a blog post about this. Put a comment up there and be honest. As an auditor in the past, I had my heart removed for a while. I had to have it put back in. And so I can take it. So, give me your feedback. Anybody have any questions?
I'm sure everyone in the room will agree that, when it comes to security is more of a cost center than a profit center. The question is how do you, at the same time, convince, and especially as the organization grows larger, the company to invest all those extra dollars on something that's so abstract, that's not really tangible and kind of hard to be quantifiable, when they could just say, oh, well, we'll just go buy this latest piece of gadget that we can stick somewhere in there, and that makes us secure because it's been certified by these people to make us secure.
Right. Yeah, that's a good question. The honest answer that I would give you at this point is that I think a lot of people look at those boxes, those products that we can buy as obscure. They don't always see the value in that. Education is a really hard thing to sell. I'm not going to say that here's the thing that you can go in and tell your CISO or whoever. I guess what I would say to them is that if we don't measure what our education program is doing, how do we know if our people are getting it? And if we're constantly having issues, and this may be a better point, the way you sell a product to your organization is to say, well, we got breached, or this could happen in a breach, so we need this product. I would say the same thing. We have an education program, and still users are writing their passwords on Post-it notes. That's not something that's easily quantifiable, as you said, but it's something that you almost have to create a culture around first at a low cost or no cost, and roll it out, and then get the buy-off to make it bigger. That would probably be my best advice at this point. Yeah, they said risk management. Yeah.
Yeah, you talked about the intervention process as a way of sort of avoiding the labeling. But I've also found that labeling is a good way of helping people to understand that they have those deficiencies.
Right.
So how do you deal with that situation?
Yeah, labeling, it's 6 of one, half dozen of the other. Like I said, in schools, if you don't have a label, you don't get that special ed assistance from the feds, and so then you don't get that assistance at all. Same, you have to be able to deal with labels. I have a label of an auditor. Chris will never let me live that down, even though I'm not an auditor anymore. But that's a label. It's a word. Does it describe who I am? Well, it may describe my past or experiences that I've had. But if you ask me who I am, I tell you that I'm a father and a husband. So to your point, how do you deal with labels? I think you have to give labels in some aspects. Go ahead.
Not necessarily that. I mean, in a way, you're hamstringing the person that might deserve that label by
Right.
not allowing them to understand they have that deficiency.
Well, and that's why you go through, when you talk about the 3-tier model, if they really need that label, you'll get them to that label. They're not going to be resolved in the first or second tiers. They're going to be pushed to that 3rd tier. So if they truly need that label, and if you see that label as being beneficial, push through to the top tier. Make that label stick, because in the end, what we're in the business of doing as security professionals is being secure. And so if it's going to make us secure, let's make the label work. Does that?
Any other questions for Jeff? All right, if not, you can catch him in the hallway track over there to harass him.
Thanks for listening, guys.
All right, thanks, Jeff. Okay, a couple logistical things.